Thank you. Fellow Toastmasters and our most welcome guests, Gulag. The mere word is enough to strike terror in the hearts of generations of Russians. Gulag. It is the epitome. It stands for one of the greatest perpetrations of terror in the 20th century. And the reason I wanted to speak to you about Gulag this evening is because it's not something that's part of our collective consciousness. Even though it's the root of one of the greatest mass murders in human history, we're not aware of it. Gulag, for those of you who are unaware of what the Gulag is an acronym for the Central Camp Administration, and it's the Russian penal system, the concentration camps, spread across Russia, mostly in the north and in the far east. And it was a central part of their economic system, not to mention their political system. The Gulags actually date back well, into the Tsarist regime, but they really became popular under Stalin, particularly in 1929, when Joseph decided that, hey, I can use this as a tool of economic policy. I can essentially have forced labor being paid nothing, and they can be manufacturing goods for nothing. It's going to be good for the economy. And it might help me a little politically also. And that is where the real horror lies. Because the people that ended up in these concentration camps weren't in the camps because of what they did. They were in the camps because of who they were. And who they were was very arbitrary, whether they were Poles or Ukrainians or Chechens or Jewish or homosexuals or gypsies or political dissenters, or whether they wrote a poem that Stalin didn't like, or whether their neighbors squealed on them to the secret police. It was arbitrary. And the extent and the scope of these mass arrests and the incarceration in these horrible camps is undescribable. Joseph Stalin was one of the greatest mass murderers in human history, and it was through the Gulag system that he perpetrated his terror. As I mentioned, it started in 1929, and it basically increased throughout the 30s, and as he became very repressive in 37, 38, the number of prisoners really ramped up. And it wasn't until the early 50s, actually March 5th, 1953, when Joseph Stalin died, that the system started winding down. But it was still in place up until Gorbachev basically dismantled the Soviet Union. The extent of the system is mind-boggling. There's a total of 476 central camp administrations that were documented, with literally thousands of prison camps. And the size and the scope of these camps is anywhere from a couple hundred people manufacturing munitions to virtual cities in the far east and Siberia, So they're very diverse, and the only thing that they had in common was that it was arbitrary as to who was there. Another thing that bears mentioning is the brutality of the system. People would get picked up middle of the night, come to their door, or they're down at the train, in the train station, sort of just, a couple of secret police just, walk them off, and they'd be down at the city police station, interrogated, often tortured for a few days, before being loaded off into cattle cars for a 2-week trip off to Siberia. A lot of people didn't even make the trip out east because the conditions on these trains was just brutal, and the guards, giving somebody water or feeding them, guess what? That's work. And why bother? So some people starved or, if are essentially dying of malnutrition along the way, it doesn't matter. Once they got there, they were in for a very rough time. And unlike the German concentration camps where it was essentially death camps, the Russian system didn't really need to kill people, because even though mass murder was quite common, and even though people died by the millions, the reality was that they were there to work. And the reality is that they didn't have to actively murder them to kill them. They would die anyways. They would die out of neglect. The whole way that people were paid for work was food. And if you were strong and you were in with a good team, you would typically get enough food to survive. But if you were weak, and if you weren't doing enough work, your rations were cut. And guess what? You weren't getting enough food to survive on. So malnutrition killed many of them. The actual mortality rates in these camps varied from year to year, but in the worst years was during the war, 41, 42. A quarter of the camp inmates would die each of these years. They estimate a total of about 2.7 million died in the camps. A total of about 18 million Russians passed through the camps. Think about it, 18 million Russians. That doesn't include the people that were forced into, banished to the Far East, and they were forced labor also, although they were behind barbed wire. So virtually every Russian citizen was affected by it. Members of their family torn away in the middle of the night, children separated from their parents. The disruption and the horror and the arbitrariness of what amounts to one of the greatest evils in modern history is unfathomable. And we should all be aware of it, because the Nazi atrocities in World War II are well documented, and nobody will ever forget that horror. But the horrors of Soviet Stalinist Russia and the Gulag is another perpetration of evil on an unfathomable scale that we should never forget. Hello, Toastmaster.
Thanks so much, Kris, for a nice speech. Now, please, everybody, take a couple of minutes filling the evaluation form. S'il vous plaît, prenez quelques minutes pour remplir les formulaires d'évaluation.